The lie didn't unravel, it snapped. One moment, I was Eleanor Vance, a grandmother waiting patiently in the glacial expanse of O'Hare's Terminal 3 for her family to fetch her for their grand Bahamian vacation. The next, I was just a woman abandoned next to a wilting ficus tree, the echo of my son's voice a shard of ice in my memory. "Just stay in the lounge, Mom. It's easier this way." Easier for whom? I had sat there for 8 hours. 8. I'd watched the sun climb the sky through the grimy floor-to-ceiling windows. I'd watched the tides of humanity ebb and flow, and I had watched the departure screen cycle through destinies bound for Tokyo, London, and Rome. But the 1:45 p.m. flight to Nassau, the one my son Julian and his wife Serena were on, had blinked off the screen hours ago. The realization came not as a wave of panic, but as a cold, crystalline certainty. I remembered the brittle edge to Serena's smile as she'd handed me a water bottle. "You've done enough, Eleanor." I just relax. I remembered the way Julian refused to meet my eyes, his focus entirely on ushering my grandchildren, Leo and Maya, through the security gate. I remembered the matching t-shirts Serena had insisted upon, mine a hideous shade of coral with Island Grandma printed in bubbly white letters. It was a costume for a role I was apparently not meant to play. It wasn't a mistake. Julian was meticulous, a man who organized his life into spreadsheets. He didn't forget things, he discarded them. I stood up, my joints protesting the long stillness. I walked not to the airline counter to beg for information I already knew, but to the women's restroom. I locked myself in a stall, sat on the closed lid, and breathed. No tears came. Crying felt like a luxury for a different kind of woman, one who still believed in accidental cruelty. This was intentional. This was an excision. When I emerged, the airport's frantic daytime energy was dimming into the weary hum of evening. I stared at the main departure board, the flickering destinations no longer a source of vicarious excitement, but a menu of possibilities. My eyes scanned the list, passing over the familiar and the mundane until they landed on a name that felt like a half-forgotten dream. Santa Fe, 7:35 p.m. I don't know why I chose it. Perhaps it was the memory of a road trip with my late husband Derek decades ago, the scent of pinyon smoke and the raw, red earth. Perhaps it was simply the furthest thing, spiritually, from the humid, manicured prison of a Bahamian resort. I walked to the ticket counter, a woman with a new, dangerous clarity. "One ticket to Santa Fe," I said to the young woman behind the glass. She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the coral shirt I still wore. "Tonight?" "Yes." "Round trip?" A ghost of a smile touched my lips. "No, just one way." I paid with a credit card from an account Julian didn't know existed, a small secret I'd kept since before his wedding. I had just enough for the flight, a cheap motel, and what I hoped would be a beginning. I found the nearest trash can, stripped off the Island Grandma shirt, and stuffed it deep inside. Then, turning off my phone and dropping it into my purse like a dormant serpent, I walked toward my gate. On the plane, as the glittering grid of Chicago fell away beneath me, I realized I wasn't just flying away from them. I was flying toward myself. I landed in Santa Fe just after 10. The airport was a whisper compared to O'Hare's roar, a low-slung building of adobe and dark wood that smelled of dust and distance. Or maybe it was me who had shrunk, folded inward by the weight of a day like no other. I moved through the terminal with a deliberate slowness, not because of my 80 years, but because the need to rush had been cauterized from my soul. No one was waiting for me, and for the first time in a very long time, that felt like a form of grace. Outside, the air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dry earth and pine. I stood under the portico, just breathing it in, letting it scour the stale, recycled air of the airport lounge from my lungs. I found a bench and sat with my carry-on, the one Julian had called a relic. It was brown leather, worn at the corners, a gift from Derek on our 25th anniversary. He would have laughed at this situation, a deep, knowing sound that said, "Well, Ellie, what took you so long?" I didn't expect this, not precisely, but the seeds of it had been sown for years, in every condescending explanation, every forgotten birthday, every time I was treated as a convenience rather than a person. I opened my wallet. 2 credit cards, 1 ID, $94 in cash, and a creased, faded photograph of Derek and me standing in front of the Loretto Chapel, squinting in the New Mexico sun. I hadn't looked at it in years, but I'd never been able to throw it away. I hailed a taxi, the driver a quiet man with a long silver ponytail. I gave him the address of a motel I'd looked up on an airport kiosk, the Starlight Inn. It sounded far more romantic than it was. When we pulled up, I paid him, took my key, and walked up a flight of external stairs to room 214. The hallway smelled of bleach and old regrets. The room was Spartan, but clean. 1 bed with a thin, patterned bedspread, a chair, a television bolted to the wall. I washed my face in the small sink, the water shockingly cold. I lay down on the bed fully clothed, the blanket scratchy against my skin. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I slept without dreams. The next morning, I watched the sunrise paint the distant mountains in shades of rose and ochre. I made coffee in the sad little machine on the nightstand and sat in the stiff chair, sipping it slowly. My phone remained off. My time, for decades mortgaged to the needs of others, was now mine. The vast, terrifying, and exhilarating expanse of it stretched before me. Around 9, I left the motel and began to walk. My hip protested with a low murmur, but I pushed on. I found a small bakery where the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and baking bread. The woman behind the counter had kind eyes. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked as I paid for a pignon scone. "I used to be," I heard myself say, "a very long time ago." "Well," she smiled, "welcome back." I didn't know if I was back or if I even belonged anywhere anymore, but her words were a small, warm stone in my pocket. I asked her where one might find local listings. She pointed to a crowded corkboard by the door. I scanned the handwritten notes: guitar lessons, a lost cat, a used pickup truck for sale, and then one caught my eye: room for rent, for quiet woman, shared bath, house privileges, no drama, no nonsense, $500 month. Call Vera. The handwriting was severe, all sharp angles, as if written by someone who had no time for curves. I took a photo of the number. By noon, I'd walked 2 more blocks and found a shaded bench in a small plaza. I took a deep breath and called. The voice that answered was gravelly, laced with suspicion. "Yeah?" "I'm calling about the room for rent." A long pause. "How old are you?" 80. "You clean?" "Yes." "No loud music, no overnight guests, no sob stories?" I chuckled, a rusty sound. "My sob story days are over." "Good," she grunted. "Come by at 4. 18B Canyon Road. Bring cash for the first month if you're serious." She hung up. By 4, I stood before a low, dusty rose adobe house with a bright turquoise door. A wind chime made of silver spoons clinked softly in the breeze. The door was opened by a woman who looked to be in her late 60s with a cascade of silver hair pulled back in a messy braid and eyes the color of a stormy sky. She held a smoldering stick of sage in one hand. "You the old lady?" she asked, her voice the same gravelly tone from the phone. "I suppose I am." She stepped aside, waving the sage smoke around the doorway. "Vera," she said, "come on in. Let's see if we can stand each other." Vera's house smelled of sage, chili, and old books. It wasn't just lived in, It was inhabited, every surface telling a story. She led me through a narrow hallway lined with overflowing bookshelves into a room at the back of the house. This is it. It was small, with a simple twin bed covered in a beautiful hand-woven blanket, a small wooden desk, and a dresser. But the window was large, looking out onto a small wild garden, and the afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It felt peaceful. "It's fine," I said. "$500 a month," she said, looking me over as if assessing my structural integrity. "Cash, first of the month. You cause trouble, you're out." "We clear?" "Crystal." I reached into my purse and pulled out the crisp bills I'd withdrawn from an ATM. She took the money without counting it. "You hungry?" I realized. I was ravenous. Vera made chicken pozole and served it in thick ceramic bowls. We ate at her small kitchen table under a slowly turning fan. She didn't ask a single question about where I'd come from or why I was there. People always ask too soon, before the story has settled in your own mind. Vera just said, "I hate eating alone," and I understood that completely. After dinner, I unpacked my meager belongings: 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, my heart medication, and the faded photograph of Derek and me. I placed everything carefully in the dresser, folding each item as if it were precious. Maybe it was. That night, lying in the narrow bed, I listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the creak of old wood, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft murmur of Vera talking to her plants. I didn't turn my phone on. In the morning, I made coffee before Vera was awake. The kitchen felt more welcoming than my own had in years, perhaps because it didn't belong to people who only saw me as an obligation. By the 3rd day, I had explored the neighborhood. 3 blocks down, there was a small, bustling diner with a faded sign that read, "The Dusty Spoon." A chalkboard sign was propped in the window. "Help wanted. Morning shift, apply within." I stood there for a long moment. I hadn't worked in over 20 years, but I was no stranger to early mornings and coffee pots. Inside, the place was simple and honest: a long Formica counter, a few red vinyl booths, the air thick with the smell of coffee and fried bacon. A young woman with a nose ring was wiping down the counter. "You hiring?" I asked. She looked up, surprised. "You want to apply?" "Yes." She called to the back. "Grace?" "Someone here about the job." A sturdy woman with her hair in a tight bun and a flour-dusted apron emerged. Her name tag read Grace. Her eyes were sharp and missed nothing. "You got experience?" "I've raised a son, managed a household for 50 years, and buried a husband. I know how to make coffee, carry plates, and I don't call in sick." Grace stared at me for a beat, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Then she shrugged. "Trial shift tomorrow, 6 to 11. You make it through that, we'll talk." That night, I ironed the one decent blouse I owned. It had been less than a week since I was left behind like forgotten luggage. But something had shifted deep within me. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was moving, working, beginning. And no one needed to know, not yet. This quiet, unexpected new life was mine. The first paycheck was small, written out in Grace's neat hand in a thin envelope. I cashed it at a local bank, the young teller looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. I walked out with my chin held a little higher. Across the street was a second-hand shop. A navy blue wool coat with a subtle pattern and deep pockets caught my eye. It fit like it had been waiting for me. I paid in cash, and the girl behind the counter wrapped it in tissue paper. "You look sharp," she said. "I feel sharp," I replied. Walking home in my new coat, I saw Vera on the porch. "Look at you," she whistled. "Classy lady." The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings at the diner, afternoons walking, evenings reading in my quiet room. The ache in my feet began to fade as my body grew accustomed to the work. One morning, Grace slid a cinnamon roll across the counter to me. "Made too many," she muttered. It was her way of saying I belonged. And then there was Silas. He came in every morning around 9, a tall, slightly stooped man in his 80s with paint stains on his hands and kind, thoughtful eyes. He was a widower, an artist. We didn't talk about our lost spouses or our distant children. We talked about the quality of the light, the stubbornness of desert plants, and the brilliance of Georgia O'Keeffe. He never pried, just listened. One evening, Vera tossed an envelope onto the kitchen table. "Something for you?" No return address, but I knew the handwriting. Leo, my grandson, the only one who used to call just to talk. "Grandma," it read. "Where are you? Dad and Serena are acting crazy. They said you just vanished. I'm worried. Please let me know you're okay. I miss you." A phone number was scribbled at the bottom. His new cell. I held the letter, the paper a tangible link to a life that felt a million miles away. I didn't call. Not yet. But something inside me, a place that had been frozen solid, began to thaw. A few days later, I finally turned on the phone. It vibrated violently, a dying insect in my palm. 41 missed calls, 23 voicemails. The first were from Serena, her voice a frantic, brittle performance. "Eleanor, we're boarding. We thought you were right behind us. Call me." A lie so blatant it was almost artistic. Then came Julian, his tone shifting from clipped annoyance to righteous anger. "Mom, this isn't funny. Where are you? Fine. Do whatever you want." I deleted them all, but I saved Leo's number. The next day he called. I stared at the screen, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I answered. "Grandma?" His voice was thick with unshed tears. "I'm here, darling." A long, shuddering sigh. "You're okay." "I'm better than okay." "Where are you?" "Somewhere quiet," I said. "Somewhere I chose." He didn't demand or guilt me. He just said, "I'm glad you're safe. I really miss you." "I miss you too, sweetheart." It was enough. For now. Life was not grand, but it was whole. It had texture and peace. Then a lawyer showed up at the diner, a slick young man in a suit that was too expensive for Santa Fe. He said he represented my son. He spoke of my well-being and my assets. "My well-being is excellent," I told him, my voice steady. "And my assets are none of his concern." I walked past him, leaving him standing there with his mouth slightly open. The next escalation came in the mail a week later, a printout from a Chicago community newspaper. The headline read, "Missing Matriarch, Family Fears for Vulnerable Grandmother." There was a photo of me from 5 years ago, looking tired. The article was a masterpiece of fiction, quoting a deeply worried Julian and a distraught Serena. They painted me as a confused, fragile woman who had wandered away. "Vulnerable," Vera snorted, reading over my shoulder. "They should sue them for underestimating you." I kept the clipping. It was proof. Not of their concern, but of their deceit. It was a reminder that people only start worrying about you when they realize they've lost control of you. The final confrontation came on a gray Tuesday. Serena walked into the diner. She looked smaller in person, the polished veneer cracked. She slid into the booth across from me. "I didn't know Julian was sending the lawyer," she began. "But leaving me in the airport lounge, that was your idea?" I asked, my voice soft. Her eyes filled with tears, real or manufactured. I couldn't tell. "We panicked. The flight was boarding. 8 hours, Serena. You had 8 hours to remember you had a mother." She looked down at her perfectly manicured hands. Then she looked up, and for the first time, I saw something other than performance. I saw a tired, insecure woman. "I wasn't trying to replace you," she whispered. I didn't want your shadow in every room." It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. "I'm not your shadow, Serena," I said, standing up. "I'm my own person, and I've finally remembered how to be one." That night, I wrote one last letter, this one to Kieran. I told him he could visit, but he had to come alone. He arrived 2 weeks later, taller, sadder, but with the same gentle eyes. We didn't rehash the past. We talked about his life, my life, about books and art and the taste of freedom. Before he left, he handed me a book of poetry. "I underlined the ones that made me think of you," he said. Later, alone in my quiet room, I read a line he had marked. "There are women who rise not from fire, but from the quiet forgetting of who told them they couldn't." That night, I sat on my bed and wrote a note on a plain white card. "Dear Eleanor, you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were the one holding the key all along. They didn't lose you. They let you go. And you, my dear, you finally let go back. And look at the life that opened. Well done, love, me." I taped it to the inside of my dresser drawer. I wasn't abandoned. I was released. And in the high, dry air of New Mexico, under a sky vast enough to hold all my sorrow and all my hope, I had finally begun to grow,